Alright, I'm doing with this without a camera this time, guys, because just it's distracting and it gets in the way of the pages sometimes, and I don't know. I don't want to deal with that. And I want to pay attention to how the screen dims because I really did not think it dimmed when I least expected it. Um, and you, if you paid attention to that whole video, you would have heard me, like, basically cry out in terror that I have to fucking start this paragraph again. Well, technically, this is. Yeah, anyways. Okay. Over the next 2 decades, the sanitation plans along the border were enlarged and further equipped, and despite the disappearance of any typhus threat, the quarantine became more widespread and demanding. In 1923, U.S. Secretary of Labor James J. Davis, who was worried about lax enforcement of immigration laws along the Mexican border, asked for reports from the field about immigration processing. He received letters from the Arizona station of Ajo, San Fernando, Nogales, Naco, and Douglas, and Texas ports of El Paso, Presidio, Eagle Pass, Brownsville, Del Rio, and Laredo, all of which mentioned, usually in some detail, medical inspection. For instance, El Paso's acting insisting surgeon Irving McNeil meticulously described the modus operandi at the Santa Fe Street Bridge, noting that 90% of all arrivals equipped chemical showering. Uh, noting that 90% of all arrivals required chemical showering because of their physical appearance and perceived status as lower class laborers, he wrote. Quote, the line inspection for the Immigration Service is governed by the regulations covering the medical inspections of aliens prepared under the direction of the Surgeon General, which with certain modifications at this point on at this port on account of the fact that the arriving aliens who goes through the bathhouse at the disinfecting plant is previously thoroughly inspected while naked by a trained and experienced attendant, male or female as the case may be, and if necessary, by a medical officer as well. McNeil reiterated the same litany of showers, streams, and vaccinations that Pierce had received 6 years earlier, stressing the routinization of weekly disinfection and renewal of quarantine cards. He wrote, quote, the working classes from the neighboring Mexican cities known as locals are required to pass through the disinfecting plant once a week. A bath certificate is issued to these and taken up at the expiration of a week, and a new one being issued after each disinfection. In another letter to Davis, the Santa Fe Street Bridges inspector in charge, Will E. Solt, provided additional details about the thoroughness of the medical examiner, who was not content to stand, quote, at a distance noting and certifying obvious defects, and described procedure of streamlined efficiency, quote, the aliens are formed into single file spaced and 12 feet apart, with head coverings removed and required to pass singly with hands upraised, nails to the front before the medical examiner, who stations himself with back to light about 12 feet in front of and facing the line of approaching aliens. So people in America think that COVID was bad with what we had to do, but for the most part, all anyone had to do was wear a mask and spray their cart down if they were worried. Like, it was an option at that point. It wasn't, the mask was mandated, obviously, but you didn't have to spray your cart down. That was like, people weren't being doused to get into Walmart, even though there isn't like 24-hour Walmarts anymore, supposedly. It's still like, we got it so easy, and America still couldn't handle it. Okay. Anti-typhus delousing and fumigation were institutionalized along the U.S.-Mexican border from 1917 to the eve of World War II. By the late 1920s, for instance, El Paso had a new cyanide room for treating baggage and a full-time staff of 14 that in, included 2 supervising surgeons and 10 inspectors in charge of vaccinating immigrants, routing them into the baths, assisting with laboratory work, and running boilers and steam machines. In 1926, the revamped quarantine plant was built at Laredo's International Footbridge, allowing for delousing of more than 5,000 border crossers per day. By the early 1930s, many of the smaller border ports had received dry air sterilizers and additional personnel. This was a system characterized by clear-cut class distinction from the outset, as most middle and upper-class Mexicans were able to bypass the disinfection because they were familiar to inspectors, arrived on the train via first class, were well coiffed and dressed, or could furnish a doctor's waiver. Conversely, the majority of Mexican laborers, whether they hailed from the interior or commuted daily across the border, were required to undergo sterilization on a weekly basis and carry a card noting the date of their next shower. Although the intensity and pace varied from port to port and were sporadically enacted by attempts to control minor outbreaks of other diseases, these uh, these requirements for entry were enforced in large border cities as well as small towns such as Turungula and Roma. El Paso's disinfection plant did not cease operations until 1938, when medical inspectors decided that the combination of factors made mass sterilization unwarranted. I think in this case, sterilization means getting clean, not having your organs engineered. As often that word is usually the case. Okay. An increase in commercial aviation meant that more visa entrants and visitors now arrived at airports, not border stations. Moreover, starting in the 1920s, doctors contracted and authorized by the USPCH and the INS had begun to perform medical exams in the immigrant's country of origin. Finally, by the 1940s, antibiotics and greater access to vaccines and antibiotics had wiped out many of the contagious diseases such as measles and diphtheria that had terrified doctors and patients as at the turn of the 20th century. Nonetheless, pediatricians, streetcar passengers, and drivers were still checked for smallpox. They were vaccinated if they appeared healthy. If they were vaccinated if they appeared healthy but lacked visible scarification, and were deported if they appeared to be pocky or feverish. Hmm. By the early 1940s, Laredo and Eagle Pass appeared to have followed El Paso's example, discontinuing substantial portions of their stations and often transforming them into venereal disease treatment clinics for the U.S. Army. When the Bracero program launched to transport seasonal laborers from Mexico's interior to America's industries and farms during an upsurge of sorry about that, uh, war-driven industrialization began in 1942, the USPHS returned to more sympathetic delousing. Oh, sorry, more systematic delousing. Now, however, instead of passing through kerosene and vinegar showerings at border ports, Mexicans were dusted with DDT as they departed from the Bracero recruitment centers in Maine, Mexico. 2 years after the Bracero programs, El Paso's medical officer informed the Surgeon General that the use of DDT powder as a preventive of body lice was effective to a large extent. DDT? Isn't that the thing we put on our plants, and like a book called Silent Spring was made about that. Um, yeah, that's a little weird. Okay. The extreme nature of the extended quarantine along the U.S.-Mexican border is shown into relief by examining the Canadian border, which was uh, uh, quiescent during the same period. One of the most important reasons for this discrepancy was the racialized lens through which USPHS officials stationed along the two borders viewed the those who, categorize those who cross from one country to the next. In 1928, for example, the physicians who worked at Port Huron, Michigan, for more than 20 years wrote that the great majority of the bodies he processed consisted, quote, of the more desirable northern or western Europe, end quote. Just 2 years earlier, John W. Tappan, El Paso's chief inspector in the 1920s, published an article in the Journal of American Medical Association in which he wrote, quote, conditions differ from those on the Canadian border. We have here to contend with an alien race, one with a different language, different customs, different moral standards, and different diseases. Jeez. So I actually didn't know that this. So it was always assumed, but to me, like this is clear cut that they literally associate the people with the illnesses and the diseases, um, even though they're being picky about who they want and trying to frame it as a health issue. Uh, yes, okay. Medical rights and and racial exclusions. The border quarantine helped solidify a boundary line that had previously been much more nebulous, and in doing so helped racialize Mexicans as outsiders and demarcate Mexico as a distant demographically entity despite topographic and climatic similarity. It not only transified racial tensions in the borderlands, but also catalyzed anti-Mexican settlement sentiment on a national level and fueled nativist efforts to ban all immigration from the southern hemisphere. To a great extent, the pathologization of Mexicans represented an extension of the association of immigrants with diseases into new racial and metaphorical terrain. While those disparaged as, quote, others, end quote, have been depicted as ill, depraved, or untouchable since before the lazarettos of the Middle Ages. In the United States, the linking of foreigners with sickness entered a more spontaneous stage in the late 19th century when Chinese immigration began to be associated with physical weakness, parasitic ailments, and bubonic plague. By the early 20th century, this xenophobic logic was being applied to Eastern European, Jewish, and Middle Eastern immigrants, all of whom were explicitly targeted by nativists in the 1920s. Fears of diseased, feeble-minded, and dysgenic, quote, immigrant menace, end quote, peaked in the 1920s when Harry H. Laughlin, the superintendent of the Eugenic Record Office, was appointed, quote, expert eugenical agent, end quote, of the Committee on Immigration and Naturalization in 1921 by Seattle's Republican Representative Albert Johnson. Laughlin, Johnson, and East Texan Congressman John C. Box, all members of the American Eugenic Society, collaborated with political allies to secure passage of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which stipulated a 2% quota per nation based on the 1890s census. Passed in 1924, this legislation, also known as the National Origins Act, was biased heavily against Southern and Eastern Europeans and debarred nearly all immigration from Asia. Despite its stringency, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act did not place the Western Hemisphere under the quota system. In conjunction with the pull of long-standing family networks in the Southwest, labor demands that could not now be met by Europe and and Asian migrants, and the push of ongoing civil unrest in Mexico. This provision spurred immigration from Mexico, which rose substantially in the 1920s from somewhere around 500,000 in 1910 to 1.5 million in more than in 1930s. As Mexicans from to the United States, sometimes settling in big cities beyond the Southwest, such as Chicago and St. Louis, eugenicists eradicated their gaze from the coast to the southern border. In the latter half of the 1920s, calls to ban Mexican immigration began to be expressed in congressional chambers, scientific and popular journals, and books on the future of American nation. Reflecting the conflation of germs and genes, the image and description of Mexicans as filthy, lousy carriers that had been inspired by border quarantine merged with eugenic arguments about the bad heredity stock of immigrants. Indeed, it was not unusual for restrictions to frame their anti-Mexican sentiments around the dangers of lice and typhus. Charles M. Goeth, for example, a Sacramento real estate broker, clamored loudly for an end to Mexican entry into the United States. In the 1920s, he traveled to the Arizona border to survey health and social conditions. As a member of the National Council of the widely distributed journal Survey Graphic, Goeth had probably read the steady stream of articles that it had published about Mexico and the typhus quarantine in 1916 and 1917. Soon after his return from Arizona, Goeth founded the Immigration Study Commission with the aim of determining the extent of the mestizo peril to the American seed stock. Given a platform to disseminate his views in Eugenics, the monthly journal of the American Eugenic Society, Goeth concluded that Mexicans were scruffy and contagious. Quote, eugenically as low-powered as the Negroes, the Mexican peon is, from a sanitation standpoint, a menace. He not only does not understand health rules, being a superstitious savage, he resists them. Oh my God. Again, this is ramping up knowingly after most diseases were being hampered and they are just looking for excuses. Alright. Profiling a young couple who chose to go south of the Rio Grande where so much of the medieval persisted. For their honeymoon, Goeth had used the imagined tragedy that befell them to insist upon closure of the back door to Mexican immigrants. 3 nights after the couple's arrival at the tropical spot overflowing with bougainvillea, quote, the young bride lay tossing with an alarming temperature. Outside her bedroom door, the doctor told the almost frantic bridge room, quote, it is typhus fever, but it cannot be, the bridge room objected. Quote, we have been only in the cleanest hotels. See how scrupulously neat our quarters are? Tiled floors and all. Yes, replied the physician. But peon servants like this chambermaid, Mercedes Ramirez, are only too often contagion carriers. End quote. Reprinted as a broadside. Oh, hold on. Reprinted as a broadside for free distribution, Goeth's article depicted Mexicans as apparently healthy yet lethal carriers of deadly germs. If allowed to defile the United States, here represented by a recently married couple at the sacred moment when procreation might begin, the propagation of the American family would be doomed. Oh, jeez, this is dark. Alright. I will return with this in the next video.